Imagine the scene. It's a dark, really cold evening in Kabul, December 27th, 1979. Ordinary people, like Fatima, a teacher, maybe Abdugafu, a government employee. They suddenly hear gunfire, just erupts around 8 p.m. Or picture Layla, 22 years old, giving birth in a hospital while Soviet tanks are literally rumbling past outside. Doctors are saying, it's not a war, foreigners have come. It was this sudden, totally bewildering invasion, and it just plunged Afghanistan into decades of conflict, changing millions of lives forever. So today we're doing a deep dive into Afghanistan as a kind of crucible. And this isn't just about, a Cold War proxy battle. It's really about a place where these deep internal hopes for modernity, they just crashed headlong into intense ideological fights and, frankly, the often cynical games of outside powers, all with devastating results for the Afghan people themselves.
Exactly. And our main guide through this incredibly complex period is Elizabeth Leake's book, Afghan Crucible.
Yeah.
What makes it so effective, I think, is how it weaves together these really personal, often harrowing stories right alongside the big geopolitical picture. It helps you grasp the human cost beneath all those grand conflict narratives.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack these complexities, maybe challenge some common ideas you might have heard, and hopefully reveal some surprising things about Afghan ambitions, international maneuvering, and the just heartbreaking human tragedy that shaped the Afghanistan we know today. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Long before 1979, Afghanistan had its own quite long history of striving for modernity, right? What did that actually look like?
Yeah, that's fascinating because this quest, it really starts way back in the early 20th century. You had these groups, the constitutionalists, the Mashruta Quahan, they were called. They wanted codified government, a constitutional monarchy. They were pushing for political, social, economic development. Their ideas, well, they often got suppressed, but they laid some important groundwork.
Okay, so early seeds were planted.
Definitely. Then you get King Amanullah in the 1920s. He pushed for really rapid, sweeping reforms. Things like expanding education, changing marriage laws, outlawing forced marriage, limiting dowries, that sort of thing. He encouraged co-education, even urged women to lift the purdah, adopted Western dress himself, pushed for secular institutions.
Wow, that sounds incredibly ambitious for the time.
It was, but, and this is crucial, the sheer speed of it all and the fact that it didn't really have deep roots in traditional rural areas, that led to huge revolts across the country. Amanullah was actually forced into exile in 1929. It just highlighted these deep urban-rural divides and, the enduring power of local leaders. Later on, you still had movements like Awakened Youth pushing for progressive change. So the internal debate was definitely alive and well.
So these internal debates about Afghanistan's future, they were already intense. There's this history of reform, but also fierce backlash. So where does the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, fit into this picture?
Right, the PDPA. They emerged in early 1965, really growing out of Kabul University. They attracted these educated Afghans. Think about figures who became famous later, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar or Ahmad Shah Massoud. They became Islamists, of course, but also key PDPA members like Muhammad Najibullah, Babra Karmal, Hafizul Amin. They were inspired by, global anti-colonial movement. They saw Marxism, Leninism as the way forward, the path to overcome what they viewed as Afghanistan's stagnancy. Lenin's ideas about imperialism really struck a chord.
But you mentioned a flaw.
Yes, a dangerous one. Education was expanding, which was good, but job opportunities weren't keeping up, especially for these educated people often working for the state. So you get this widespread disillusionment with the ruling family, the Musahibans. Their system was seen as based on one family rule. It really set the stage for something radical. Frustrated ambition was a key driver. And the PDPA itself, right from the start, it was split. You had the Khalq faction, more radical, rural roots, and the Parcham faction, more urban, intellectual. This internal split, almost like a civil war within the party, ended up shaping pretty much everything that happened next.
And here's a really interesting twist. Despite having these radical Marxist roots, the PDPA, at first anyway, presented a much more moderate public face. How did they pull that off?
Well, it was very strategic. If you looked at their published platform, yes, it paid homage to the great socialist revolution of October, but crucially, it avoided explicitly mentioning Marxism-Leninism. Instead, the focus was on things like representational government and human rights. It's a smart move, really. They wanted to avoid a harsh crackdown from the state, and they knew many Afghans were wary of Soviet communism, especially after what happened to Muslims in Central Asia back in the 1920s. They were trying to look like legitimate reformers, not, foreign agents.
Okay, so the stage is set. Then April 27, 1978, the Sour Revolution happens. The PDPA takes power. What were the immediate changes? How did they actually try to reshape Afghanistan?
They moved incredibly fast. Just boom. New government structures, the Revolutionary Council, led by Taraki, they threw out Dawood's constitution. Initially, there was some ethnic diversity in the cabinet: Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, but that didn't last. Taraki and Amin quickly moved to push out the Parcham faction. So power became concentrated in the hands of the Khalq faction, mostly Ghilzai Pashtuns, and you quickly saw this cult of personality build up around Taraki. His official story emphasized his poor background, a true son of the people, contrasting him with the old elite. It even went so far as implying that God erred in predetermining leadership, which in a deeply religious society like Afghanistan was incredibly provocative.
And what about those big social and economic changes? That was central to their whole vision, right?
Yeah.
Transforming society.
Absolutely, that was the promise. They brought in two really key decrees. First, land reform. Decree 6. It aimed to outlaw usury, cancel debts for small landowners and landless farmers. They hailed it as overthrowing the feudalist system. Second, Decree 7 focused on women's rights, aiming for equal rights, getting rid of forced marriages, bride prices, limiting dowries, raising marriage ages. The rhetoric was powerful.
Sounds radical on paper, but you said there were unintended consequences.
Huge ones. Critical failures, really. The land reform, for example. Yes, it freed peasants from debt, but it also completely destroyed the traditional credit systems they relied on, the ones provided by landowners for seeds, equipment. And the PDPA didn't offer any real alternative, so it ended up alienating many of the very rural families who might have been their base. It just threw social and economic balances into chaos. Even their Soviet allies apparently bewailed how badly the PDPA handled explaining the policies or providing support, and for women's advancement. Despite the bold talk, actual progress was pretty limited, especially after a key advocate, Dr. Anahita Ratibzad, was pushed out during the Parcham Purge.
Which brings up a really important question. How did the PDPA handle Islam? I mean, it's so central to Afghan society. What was their approach, and how did people react?
Their approach was ambivalent at best and ultimately pretty hostile. At the very beginning, they did try to sort of ally itself with Islam in a few announcements. Taraki saying things like, "We are sons of Muslims." But that changed fast. Taraki started putting distance, even implying Ramadan disrupted the revolution. Government decrees stopped using the traditional Islamic Bismillah invocation, and their language got increasingly inflammatory. They started targeting Ikhwanis, that term was associated with the Muslim Brotherhood and Afghan Islamists, accusing them of acting against our society in the guise of religion. It created this impossible situation. How do you recognize daily Islamic practice but condemn religious identity as somehow anti-Afghan?
So you've got these radical reforms, often completely out of touch with local realities, massive amounts of violence, and this growing hostility to religion and tradition. What was the result?
The result was a massive violent backlash. Predictable, maybe. The PDPA's use of force, their clumsy reforms, their attacks on Islam, it all just fueled widespread resistance. The Herat Rebellion in March 1979, that was a huge wake-up call. It confirmed Soviet worries about just how unstable this regime was. Internally, things got worse, too. The PDPA infighting intensified. Amin eventually replaced Taraki. By December 1979, something like 3/4 of the country was up in arms against the government. It was full-blown civil war. And the PDPA's attacks on Islam, they basically handed the Afghan Islamists an opening to position themselves as the saviors.
Okay, so Afghanistan is in chaos. Civil war is raging. And it's into this incredibly volatile situation that the Soviet Union decides to intervene militarily. What was Moscow thinking? Why make such a huge and ultimately disastrous move?
Well, Soviet motivations were layered. The main goal was definitely to reinforce the faltering socialist state in Afghanistan, to try and reinvigorate the Afghan socialist project. They were backing Babrak Karmal, the Parcham leader, who had proposed a new regime and specifically asked for Soviet help. They also saw it as a chance to fix the failures of the Khalq faction's reforms. And crucially, there was fear. Fear that the instability from the Iranian Revolution next door could spill over into their own Muslim-majority Central Asian republics. Plus, you have Brezhnev and the Politburo's broader doctrine of proletarian internationalism, this idea of supporting pro-Soviet regimes in the developing world.
So how did the Soviets sell this intervention, both to the world and their own people? And how did that story stack up against what was actually happening?
The official story, pushed through state media like Izvestia, painted a picture of Soviet troops on peace-loving missions. Doing civic rather than martial duties, building bridges, handing out firewood, providing medical aid. They kept insisting the troops entered only at the DRA's request, portraying it as friendly cooperation between sovereign socialist states. But the reality, It was a massive political gamble that just didn't pay off. Soviet Premier Kosygin himself had warned back in March '79. He said Soviet troops would end up fighting not just foreign enemies, but also with a certain number of your people. And people do not forgive such things. He was absolutely right. The invasion basically acted like lighter fluid on the already raging civil war.
And militarily, what was the experience like for the average Soviet soldier? This wasn't the kind of war they were trained for, was it?
Not even close. The Soviet army was built for massive land wars in Europe. Conventional tank battles, large formations. What they found in Afghanistan was completely different. A scattered resistance using small-scale ambushes, guerrilla tactics, sabotage, lots of mines. Soviet strategic planning just didn't fit the reality. They could secure cities and PDPA strongholds initially, sure, but they really struggled to uproot or eliminate insurgents. And that problem was made much worse by the, frankly, tactical brilliance of some of the resistance commanders. It was a military and psychological mismatch.
So back inside Afghanistan, how did Karmal's government, the one the Soviets installed, try to stabilize things? Did they learn anything from the Khalq faction's mistakes?
Karmal was in a tough spot. He had to somehow distance himself from the Khalqis' failures while still claiming to represent authentic PDPA socialism. That meant admitting mistakes were made, especially that reforms were pushed too hastily. So pretty quickly after taking power, his government actually reversed course on land reform. They started returning state-seized land to mid-level khans, amended the rules to allow bigger plots for mullahs, tribal leaders, officials, even modern-minded owners. It was a clear attempt to win back some loyalty from traditional elites, basically divorcing land reform from its original class-based ideology. But despite these adjustments, the whole Soviet state-building effort just kind of collapsed. The alliance with Karmal didn't achieve much positive, leading Gorbachev to replace him with Mohammad Najibullah in 1986.
Okay, let's zoom out again. This Soviet invasion wasn't just a local Afghan issue. It instantly became this major flashpoint in the Cold War, pulling in all sorts of regional and international players. Everyone had an angle, right?
Oh, absolutely. Afghanistan transformed into this global crucible almost overnight. Take Pakistan, under General Zia-ul-Haq. He saw an absolutely unprecedented opportunity. He used the crisis brilliantly, you could argue, to consolidate his own autocratic rule and push his Islamization policies inside Pakistan. Pakistan, particularly its intelligence agency, the ISI, became the main channel for funneling weapons and money to the Afghan resistance. And they often manipulated which groups got the aid, favoring the Islamist parties that aligned with Zia's own vision. Peshawar became the hub for it all.
So Pakistan was key. What about other players?
Well, China saw the Soviet presence as a grave threat to regional security. They compared it to the U.S. disaster in Vietnam. So they strongly backed Pakistan, pledged more support, and apparently funneled around $400 million in weapons to the resistance through the ISI. Deng Xiaoping famously said they needed to turn Afghanistan into a quagmire for the Soviets. Then there's Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini had just come to power. He condemned the PDPA's anti-Islamic actions and the Soviet invasion itself. That provided Iran its own rationale for supporting certain Afghan Islamist groups. India, on the other hand, had closer ties to the Soviet Union and had backed Afghanistan on some regional issues. So they watched these shifts with consternation, worried about their own position. In the United States, how did Washington react and what was their strategy as this thing went global? The U.S. response was absolutely pivotal. There was some initial uncertainty after the Saur Revolution in '78. But the turning point was the death of the U.S. ambassador, Adolph Spike Dubs, in Kabul in February 1979. He was taken hostage and killed. That really hardened U.S. views against the PDPA. And here's a crucial point from Leaks research. The U.S., under President Carter, actually started covert aid to the Afghan resistance before the full Soviet invasion. They were worried about Soviet influence near the Persian Gulf oil fields. Then Carter issued his Carter Doctrine in 1980, publicly linking Afghanistan to broader regional instability and signaling a clear shift towards confronting the Soviets.
And then under Reagan, that support ramped up significantly.
Hugely. The resistance fighters were rebranded as freedom fighters. You even saw them pop up in movies like Rambo. Covert aid, funneled mostly through Pakistan's ISI, increased dramatically. This included those famous Stinger anti-aircraft missiles from 1986 onwards, which were a game-changer against Soviet air power.
Yeah.
But here's the really critical insight Leak offers. U.S. policymakers, fundamentally, cared little about the future of Afghanistan so long as the conflict embroiled the Soviets. The main goal was rolling back the Soviets, not figuring out post-conflict stability in Afghanistan. Their analysis often fell back on old British colonial ideas, viewing Afghans through this lens of tribalism and backwardness. They showed little interest in either uniting or directing the insurgency.
So you have all this external money and weapons pouring in, fueling this diverse Afghan resistance. But as you said, it wasn't unified at all, was it? What were these different groups actually fighting for besides just getting the Soviets out?
That's such a critical point. The resistance was incredibly fragmented. You had different visions for Afghanistan's future clashing. On one side, you had the more traditionalist parties, leaders like Pir Said Ahmad Gilani or Sibghatullah Mujahideen. These groups often included allies of the old royal family, Sufi leaders, traditional clergy. They mostly wanted to sort of return to and continue the more moderate modernization processes associated with the monarchy.
Okay, so a return to a kind of pre-PDPA status quo for them.
Largely, yes. Then you had the Islamist parties, and they proved better organized and more effective in combat, partly because they got the lion's share, nearly three-quarters of the foreign funding by the late 80s. But even within the Islamists, there were major differences. You had Hizb Islami, led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, very militant, very tightly organized, emphasized the primacy of Sharia. But interestingly, some of their economic promises, like land redistribution, actually mirrored the PDPA's socialist ideas. And Hekmatyar was very focused on political power after the Soviets left. Then there was Jamiat Islami, led by Burhanuddin Rabbani, with Ahmad Shah Massoud as its famous commander. They were generally seen as more moderate Islamists, more willing to build alliances. Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir, became this international icon, known for his military skill, but also for trying to set up actual functioning administrations in the areas he controlled.
So even among the Islamists, very different approaches. And you mentioned these differences led to actual fighting between resistance groups, while they're also fighting the Soviets.
Absolutely. The divisions weren't just ideological. They were deep personal rivalries. Hekmatyar, for instance, saw Massoud as a major threat. He criticized Massoud for making a temporary truce with the Soviets in '83. And apparently, Hekmatyar's forces even orchestrated clashes with Massoud's men, sometimes cutting off their supply lines, specifically to weaken Jamiat. Leak notes that Soviet observers actually looked on with delight at this infighting. They even tried to copy some of Jamiat's civic projects to try and win local support themselves. And again, you can't forget the external factor. Pakistan's ISI tended to favor groups like Hekmatyar's Hizb Islami, which aligned with Zia's Islamist agenda and were hostile to Pashtun nationalism. That definitely fueled the fragmentation.
Wow. Okay, shifting focus slightly. Beyond all the politics and fighting, the human cost of this was just immense. We're talking about one of the biggest refugee crises the modern world has seen.
Colossal, just staggering numbers. At its peak, say between 1985 and 1990, estimates suggest 6.2 million Afghans were refugees, mostly in Pakistan and Iran. People fled for all sorts of reasons. Soviet bombing, government bombing, forced conscription into the Afghan army, pressure to join local PDPA groups, and violence wasn't just from one side. Resistance groups committed abuses too. Civilians were just caught in the middle. The personal stories Leak includes are just devastating, like Masood Farivar's account of waiting outside Puli-Charki prison for his uncle day after day, knowing he'd probably never reappear. It captures the sheer terror of the PDPA state for ordinary people.
So for millions, exile was the only choice. What was life actually like in those huge refugee camps? And what did it mean for them to call themselves Mohajir?
That term, Mohajir, became really important. It's Arabic for refugee, yes, but it has deep religious meaning. It specifically refers to the Prophet Muhammad's followers who fled persecution in Mecca. So by adopting this term, Afghan exiles framed their flight not just as displacement, but as a religiously significant act, fleeing persecution by non-believers. It gave them a sense of dignity in terrible circumstances. But life in the camps themselves, it meant massive upheaval and insecurity. Refugees were constantly monitored, managed by this huge apparatus involving the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and the Pakistani government.
And the UN tried to impose its own vision, too.
In a way, yes. Alik points out the irony here. The UNHCR had these modernizing goals. They tried to promote a single Afghan national identity over older ethnic or tribal loyalties. They set up health clinics, schools, vocational training, aiming to reshape refugees into, quote, liberal citizens capable of exercising choice. But think about it. Many Afghans fled precisely because they didn't want the government interfering in their lives. And then in the camps, they found themselves subjected to another, often even more invasive form of government oversight, especially for women whose mobility was often much more restricted in the camps than it might have been back in their rural villages due to stricter enforcement of purdah.
So, with millions displaced and the resistance itself fragmented, what did all this mean for international efforts to find a diplomatic solution, especially at the UN?
Well, the UN certainly became a key stage for the diplomatic arguments. The General Assembly passed resolutions condemning the Soviet invasion early on, even though the Soviets used their veto in the Security Council. Eventually, after years of talks, you get the Geneva Accords signed in April 1988. These focused mainly on getting Soviet troops out and setting conditions for refugees to return safely.
But there is a major problem with those accords.
A critical flaw, yes. The accords completely excluded the Afghan resistance groups and the refugees themselves from the negotiations. UN diplomats tended to view them as non-state actors, not legitimate political entities. This totally undermined their declarations of sovereign power. End quote. So even though countries like Pakistan and the U.S. were arming the resistance on the ground, they did not advocate for their political legitimacy in the diplomatic arena at the UN. It meant that the fundamental questions about Afghanistan's political future, about its path to modernity, were left completely unresolved by the very people whose lives were at stake.
So the Soviets finally pull out in February 1989. Did that bring peace? Did it pave the way for stability? Or was it just the end of one chapter and the start of another equally tragic one?
Sadly, peace did not follow. Mohammad Najibullah, the former secret police chief who replaced Karmal, he did try a policy of national reconciliation starting in 1987. He rolled back some of the earlier PDPA policies, embraced private enterprise, tried to engage non-party tribal and Islamic leaders, even used traditional jirgas. Gorbachev apparently told him to revive Islam, respect traditions, but it just didn't gain much traction. The Afghan army was plagued by desertions, the economy was destroyed, and the government was still totally dependent on dwindling Soviet aid. Najibullah managed to hang on until March 1992, but he eventually resigned under pressure. He tried to flee, was stopped, and ended up hiding in the UN compound in Kabul for years, only to be dragged out, tortured, and publicly executed by the Taliban when they took Kabul in 1996. A really grim end to the whole PDPA project.
And that power vacuum after the Soviets left, that's when the infighting among the resistance groups really exploded, isn't it? The very groups that fought the Soviets turned on each other.
Exactly, a truly tragic turn. There was the Peshawar Accord in April 1992, an attempt to create an interim government among the main resistance parties, though Hekmatyar initially stayed out. It proposed a rotating leadership, followed by a council and elections. But the fundamental problem, as Leak puts it, was that no one could agree who should take part in a coalition government. There was constant fighting around Kabul, accusations of manipulation, boycotts. New agreements were signed in '93, bringing Hekmatyar in, but the fighting just continued. The country basically descended into a brutal civil war fought between former allies.
And it's out of that chaos, that prolonged instability and infighting, that this new force emerges, the Taliban.
Precisely. The Taliban presented themselves as this disciplined, structured alternative to the feuding Mujahideen factions. They gained a surprising amount of initial support from ordinary Afghans who were just exhausted by the constant fighting and corruption. They promised order. And crucially, they got backing from the government of Pakistan, which had grown disillusioned with Hekmatyar and saw the Taliban as a way to finally bring some stability and pursue its own regional interests, especially towards Central Asia. The Taliban rapidly gained ground, took province after province, and captured Kabul in 1996. Their rule became known for extremely conservative social policies, the infamous destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, and brutal violence, including what's described as an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Hazara. They became international pariahs, though recognized by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE.
So what does this all add up to? This whole deep dive seems to reveal this incredibly tragic, almost cyclical pattern of conflict, internal division, and external meddling in Afghanistan.
That's exactly right. The entire period we've been talking about from the late 70s onwards was this messy, drawn-out struggle over what modernity should even mean for Afghanistan. It was fought between wildly different Afghan visions, but it was also profoundly shaped, distorted even, by foreign powers pursuing their own Cold War or regional interests. And the really sobering truth that comes through in Leak's work is that the cycle of violence precipitated by the 1978 PDPA coup has not ended. She shares this incredibly poignant testimony from Nargis Nuzai Faizan, who lost her father to insurgents when she was 4 and then her husband to another insurgency when she was 30. It just powerfully underscores the enduring human cost. After decades of systematized violence, a return to some kind of pre-1978 normalcy was simply not possible. Afghans were forced to constantly create a new, often terrifying normal for themselves.
Wow, what an incredibly complex and just profoundly heartbreaking journey through Afghanistan's modern history. We've really seen how these internal dreams of a modern nation just collided head-on with intense ideological battles and Yeah, the often cynical realpolitik of outside powers.
Indeed. And the book Afghan Crucible really drives home how this country, caught right in the crosshairs of global and regional rivalries, became this literal crucible. Millions of ordinary Afghans just caught in the crossfire. The constant attempts to reshape Afghan society, the staggering human costs, especially that massive, enduring refugee crisis, and the seemingly endless cycle of violence, they're just stark reminders of the incredibly long-lasting consequences of these conflicts.
So after all that, what should we be left thinking about? What's a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to mull over after this deep dive?
Well, we've seen how so many different actors, both Afghan groups and foreign powers, consistently tried to define and impose their specific vision of modernity onto Afghanistan, sometimes maybe with good intentions, sometimes clearly out of strategic self-interest. So it raises this really difficult question, doesn't it? When the pursuit of any ideal, whether it's socialism or a particular form of Islamism or Western-style democracy, gets tangled up with foreign intervention and brutal internal power struggles, does that pursuit inevitably end up negating the very self-determination it supposedly aimed to champion?